The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace courtyard as Lady Eleanor Whitmore stood at the grand window of her private chambers. Her fingers trembled slightly as she held the official letter that had arrived just hours before. The elegant script seemed to blur before her eyes as she read the words again, hoping somehow they might change. But there it was, written in the formal language of duty and protocol that had governed her life for the past 15 years. Sir James Ashford, her beloved husband and the Duke of Ravenshollow, had been called to serve as the Crown's special envoy to the war-torn regions of Eastern Europe. It was an honor, the letter emphasized, a testament to his diplomatic skills and unwavering loyalty to the realm. But Eleanor knew what it really meant. It meant months, perhaps even a year, of separation from the man who had been her anchor in the sometimes turbulent waters of royal life. Eleanor moved away from the window and walked slowly to her dressing table, where a silver-framed photograph of their wedding day caught the morning light. She was radiant in white silk, James handsome in his military dress uniform, both of them young and filled with dreams of a future together. That was before the weight of their titles, before the endless obligations, before they truly understood what it meant to serve something greater than themselves. The sound of footsteps in the hallway outside her door made her heart race. She recognized that particular rhythm, the confident stride that belonged to only one person. James appeared in the doorway, his usually immaculate appearance slightly disheveled, his dark hair falling across his forehead in a way that reminded her of when they first met at university, long before crowns and duties complicated their love. "You've seen the letter?" he said simply, his voice carrying a weight that matched the gravity in his blue eyes. It wasn't a question. In 15 years of marriage, they had learned to read each other's emotions like familiar books. Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. She had always prided herself on her composure, her ability to maintain dignity even in the most challenging circumstances. It was a skill that had served her well in her role as a member of the royal family. But this morning, that carefully cultivated composure felt as fragile as spun glass. James crossed the room in 3 quick strides and took her hands in his. His palms were warm and slightly rough from his morning ride, a small detail that she found herself memorizing. "I wanted to tell you myself before the official announcement," he said softly. "I couldn't bear for you to hear it from anyone else." The mission, he explained, was crucial. The region had been devastated by conflict, and delicate negotiations were needed to establish humanitarian corridors and begin the long process of rebuilding. James's expertise in international relations and his reputation as a fair and honest broker made him the ideal candidate. It was work that mattered, work that could save lives and bring hope to thousands of displaced families. Eleanor understood all of this intellectually. She had always supported James's work, had been proud of his accomplishments and his dedication to making the world a better place. But understanding and accepting were 2 very different things, especially when acceptance meant watching the love of her life walk into danger. "When do you leave?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer from the urgency in his manner. 3 days, James replied, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. "I know it's sudden, but the situation is deteriorating rapidly. Every day we delay means more suffering for innocent people. 3 days, 72 hours to prepare for a separation that could last months. 72 hours to memorize every detail of his face, every inflection of his voice, every gesture that made him uniquely hers." It seemed impossibly short and yet terrifyingly long, each minute stretching before them like an eternity. Outside their window, the palace grounds were coming to life. Gardeners tended to the rose bushes that Eleanor had personally selected years ago, their blooms a riot of color against the manicured green lawns. Staff members moved with purpose along the stone pathways, beginning another day of service to the crown. Life continued its relentless forward march, indifferent to the quiet drama unfolding in the Duchess's private chambers. Eleanor pulled her hands free from James's gentle grasp and walked to her writing desk. Among the neat stacks of correspondence and official documents lay her personal journal, its leather cover worn soft from years of use. She opened it to a blank page and reached for her fountain pen. "I want to write to you," she said, her voice stronger now, steadied by the decision to take some small action. "Every day you're gone, I want to write to you, and I want you to write to me, not just the official reports, but real letters, about what you see, what you feel, what you remember about home. James smiled for the first time that morning, the expression transforming his worried features. "I'd like that very much," he said. "Though I warn you, my handwriting hasn't improved since our university days." "I don't care if I need a magnifying glass to read it," Eleanor replied, surprising herself with a small laugh. "I just want to feel connected to you, even when you're half a world away." The weight of their impending separation settled around them like a heavy cloak. But beneath the sadness was something else, a renewed appreciation for what they had built together, for the love that had sustained them through 15 years of challenges and triumphs. In 3 days, James would board a plane that would take him away from everything familiar and dear. But today they were still together, still able to touch and hold and speak the words that mattered most. As the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, Eleanor and James began the difficult task of preparing for goodbye, not knowing that their private moment of tenderness was about to become something much larger, something that would touch the hearts of an entire nation. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of preparations, official meetings, and stolen moments of intimacy. Eleanor threw herself into helping James organize his departure, partly to stay busy and partly because she needed to feel useful during this overwhelming time. Together, they sorted through documents, packed essential items, and reviewed the detailed briefings that would guide his mission. In the Duke's private study, maps covered the mahogany desk like a colorful patchwork quilt. Red pins marked areas of conflict, blue ones indicated refugee camps, and green showed potential safe zones for humanitarian aid. James traced the routes with his finger as he explained the complexities of the situation to Eleanor, his voice taking on the professional tone he used during official briefings. But she could see the concern in his eyes, the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like armor. Eleanor had always admired her husband's dedication to service, but seeing him prepare for this particular mission filled her with a mixture of pride and terror. The region he was heading to was volatile, unpredictable. Communication would be difficult, and there were no guarantees about his safety. Yet she knew he had to go. It was who he was, this man who couldn't ignore suffering when he had the power to help alleviate it. Their 2 children, Princess Isabella, age 12, and Prince Alexander, age 9, sensed the tension in the house despite their parents' attempts to maintain normalcy. Isabella, wise beyond her years and already showing signs of the diplomatic instincts she'd inherited from both parents, asked direct questions about her father's upcoming trip. Alexander, more emotional and intuitive, simply stayed closer to James than usual, following him from room to room like a loyal shadow. On the second evening, Eleanor found James in Alexander's bedroom, reading the boy's favorite adventure story. Their son was curled against his father's side, fighting sleep because he didn't want to waste precious time. The scene was so tender, so perfectly ordinary that Eleanor felt her heart might break from the beauty and fragility of it. "Will you bring me something back from your trip, Papa?" Alexander asked sleepily, his small hand clutching James's shirt. "What would you like?" James replied, his voice gentle as he smoothed his son's hair. "A story," the boy said without hesitation. "Not from a book, but a real story about the people you help. Mama says stories help us understand the world better." Eleanor saw James swallow hard before answering. "I promise," he said solemnly. "I'll bring you back the most amazing stories you've ever heard." Later that night, after the children were asleep, Eleanor and James walked through the palace gardens hand in hand. The evening air was soft and fragrant with the scent of jasmine, and stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. They followed familiar paths they had walked countless times before, but tonight, every step felt precious and finite. "I keep thinking about our first separation," Eleanor said quietly. "Do you remember? When you had to go to Geneva for those trade negotiations just 6 months after we were married?" James smiled at the memory. "You cried at the airport, and I thought I was the luckiest man alive because someone that wonderful actually missed me. I was terrified you'd realize you were better off without me," Eleanor admitted. "I was so young, so insecure about whether I was cut out for this life. And now I know we're better together than apart, but I also know that sometimes apart is necessary." She squeezed his hand. "I'm not the same frightened girl who watched you leave all those years ago. I'm stronger now, thanks partly to you believing in me." They paused beside the fountain that had been Eleanor's wedding gift from James's grandmother, the Dowager Duchess. The water caught the moonlight as it danced, creating patterns of silver light that shifted and changed like their own relationship had evolved over the years. "There's something I need to tell you," James said, his tone becoming serious. "The press has gotten wind of the mission. They don't have all the details yet, but they know something significant is happening. Margaret thinks we should make an official announcement tomorrow, before the speculation gets out of hand." Margaret Thornfield was their communications director, a sharp-minded woman who had guided them through numerous public relations challenges over the years. If she thought they needed to go public, the situation was serious. Eleanor felt a familiar tightness in her chest. Their private pain was about to become public property, subject to analysis and commentary from people who had never faced such choices themselves. The thought of cameras and questions and the endless speculation that would follow made her feel exposed and vulnerable. "What kind of announcement?" she asked. "A brief statement about the mission, its importance, and its duration. Margaret suggests we include a personal element, something that shows the human side of public service. She thinks it might help people understand why this work matters." Eleanor nodded slowly. She had learned long ago that their lives belonged as much to the public as to themselves. People looked to them for examples of duty, sacrifice, and resilience. If sharing their story could inspire others or build support for humanitarian work, then it was another form of service. "Will we do it together?" she asked. "If you're willing." Margaret thinks a joint statement would be more powerful, show unity and mutual support. The idea of standing before cameras and reporters while her heart was breaking seemed almost impossible. But Eleanor had faced impossible things before. She thought of the refugee families James would be working to help, people who had lost everything and were depending on the kindness of strangers for survival. Her temporary discomfort seemed small in comparison. "Of course," she said firmly. "We'll do it together." As they walked back toward the palace, Eleanor caught sight of a light still burning in Isabella's bedroom window. Their daughter was probably reading, a habit that reminded Eleanor strongly of herself at that age. Tomorrow, after the press conference, the children would fully understand what their father's departure meant. They would see their parents' pain reflected in newspaper headlines and television broadcasts. It was another burden of their unique life, the way private moments became public property. But tonight, they were still just a family facing a difficult goodbye. Tomorrow would bring cameras and questions and the weight of public expectation. Tonight was theirs alone, and Eleanor intended to treasure every remaining moment. The morning of James's departure was dawning, and with it would come the most difficult day of Eleanor's adult life. But she would face it with dignity, grace, and the strength that came from knowing their love could survive anything, even the pain of necessary separation. The morning of the press conference dawned gray and drizzly, as if the weather itself reflected the somber mood that had settled over the palace. Eleanor stood before her full-length mirror, adjusting the sapphire blue dress she had chosen for the occasion. The color had always been James's favorite on her, and she wanted to wear something that would remind him of happier moments when the cameras captured what might be their last public appearance together for many months. Her lady-in-waiting, Sarah, hovered nearby with jewelry options, but Eleanor waved them away. Today wasn't about sparkle or grandeur. Today was about authenticity, about showing the nation that even those who served at the highest levels were human beings, with hearts that could break. James appeared in the doorway of her dressing room, looking distinguished in his charcoal gray suit. He had chosen to wear the tie she had given him for their 10th wedding anniversary, a small navy silk square that bore the family crest. These tiny details mattered, these silent communications of love and connection that only they would understand. "Ready?" he asked softly, though they both knew that no one could ever truly be ready for what lay ahead. "As ready as I'll ever be," Eleanor replied, taking one last look at her reflection. The woman staring back at her looked composed and dignified, but Eleanor could see the sadness lurking in her own eyes, the way her smile didn't quite reach them. The press conference was scheduled for 11 o'clock in the palace's blue drawing room, a formal space that struck the right balance between official gravity and personal warmth. Margaret Thornfield had spent hours arranging every detail, from the positioning of the chairs to the angle of the cameras, ensuring that the visual message would support the spoken words. As they walked down the corridor toward the drawing room, Eleanor could hear the murmur of voices and the clicking of camera equipment being prepared. Reporters from major newspapers and television stations had gathered, along with photographers whose job it would be to capture this moment for posterity. The thought that images of their goodbye would be preserved forever, studied and analyzed by strangers, felt surreal. "Remember," James whispered as they paused outside the door. "We're showing them that love and duty can coexist, that sacrifice is sometimes the deepest expression of caring." Eleanor nodded, squaring her shoulders and lifting her chin in the gesture that had become her trademark over the years. Together they entered the room, and immediately the atmosphere changed. Conversation stopped, cameras turned their way, and dozens of pairs of eyes focused on them with an intensity that felt almost physical. Margaret stepped forward to make the introductions and provide context, her voice professional and clear as she explained the humanitarian crisis that had prompted James's assignment. She spoke about the Duke's qualifications, his previous diplomatic successes, and the critical importance of the mission he was about to undertake. When it was their turn to speak, James rose first. His statement was brief but powerful, outlining his commitment to serving those in greatest need and his determination to help establish lasting peace in the troubled region. He spoke about the families who had been displaced, the children who had lost their homes, and the urgent need for international cooperation in addressing the crisis. "This is not a decision I make lightly," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion Eleanor could see in his posture. "It means leaving behind everything and everyone I hold most dear. But sometimes the greatest expressions of love require the greatest sacrifices, and I believe deeply that this work can make a difference in countless lives." Then it was Eleanor's turn. She had rehearsed her remarks several times, but standing there under the bright lights with cameras recording her every expression, the prepared words seemed inadequate. Instead, she spoke from her heart. "As James's wife and partner, I'm immensely proud of his dedication to service," she began, her voice clear and strong. "But I would be less than honest if I didn't acknowledge that this separation will be one of the most difficult challenges our family has ever faced. Like any wife, like any mother, I worry about his safety and count the days until his return." She paused, gathering her courage for the next part. "But I also know that our personal comfort cannot come before the suffering of others. If James's work can help even one family find safety, if it can help one child return to school, if it can help one community begin to heal, then our temporary sacrifice will have meaning beyond our own lives." The questions that followed were respectful but probing. Reporters wanted to know about the timeline for James's return, about Eleanor's plans during his absence, about how they would maintain their connection across such distance. Some questions touched on the broader implications of the mission, while others focused on the personal cost of public service. Throughout it all, Eleanor and James presented a united front, their hands occasionally touching, their glances communicating volumes that words could not express. They answered honestly about their concerns while emphasizing their shared commitment to the mission's success. One reporter asked if they had any message for other families facing separation due to military or humanitarian service. Eleanor's response came straight from her heart. "You are not alone in your sacrifice. The fear, the loneliness, the worry you feel, these are shared by everyone who loves someone serving others. Find strength in community, in the knowledge that your loved one's work matters, and in the certainty that love can bridge any distance." As the press conference concluded, Eleanor felt emotionally drained but oddly relieved. The public now knew what they were facing, and somehow that felt like sharing a burden rather than exposing a weakness. The cameras had captured their pain, yes, but they had also captured their strength, their unity, and their commitment to something larger than themselves. Walking back to their private quarters, Eleanor realized that in just a few hours this man beside her would board a plane that would take him away from everything familiar. The press conference had been necessary, but it had also consumed precious time they could never get back. "No more official duties today," James said firmly, as if reading her thoughts. "The rest of the day belongs to us, to our family, to the moments we want to remember." Eleanor squeezed his hand gratefully. Soon enough the world would have its story of duty and sacrifice. For now they still had time to write their own story of love and goodbye. The final afternoon belonged entirely to family. Eleanor had instructed the staff to hold all calls and visitors, creating a protective bubble around their last precious hours together. In the family's private sitting room, away from the formal grandeur of the state apartments, They gathered for what had become an impromptu celebration of memory and love. Isabella had prepared a small photo album for her father, carefully selecting pictures from family holidays, birthdays, and quiet moments at home. Each page told a story, and as she presented it to James, her young voice wavered only slightly as she explained her choices. There was the photo from last Christmas morning, all four of them still in pajamas around the tree. Another showed James teaching Alexander to fish during their summer holiday in Scotland, both of them laughing as Alexander's line tangled hopelessly in the reeds. "This one is my favorite," Isabella said, pointing to a candid shot Eleanor had taken just weeks earlier. James was reading in his study while Alexander dozed against his shoulder, a scene of such ordinary contentment that it captured the essence of their family life better than any formal portrait ever could. James studied each page carefully, his fingers tracing the edges of the photographs as if trying to memorize their texture. "This is perfect, sweetheart," he told his daughter, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll look at it every day and remember how lucky I am to have such a thoughtful daughter." Alexander, not to be outdone by his sister's eloquent gift, had drawn a picture of the four of them standing in front of the palace. His artistic skills were still developing, but the love behind the crayon figures was unmistakable. He had drawn himself holding his father's hand, and in the corner of the paper, he had written in careful letters, "Come home soon, Papa." Eleanor watched her children present their gifts and felt her heart swell with pride even as it ached with approaching loss. Despite their privileged upbringing, both Isabella and Alexander understood that their father's departure was about service to others, about putting the needs of strangers before the comfort of home. It was a lesson in citizenship and humanity that no textbook could teach. As the afternoon wore on, they played games that had become family traditions. James and Alexander engaged in their ongoing chess tournament, with the 9-year-old showing remarkable improvement under his father's patient tutelage. Eleanor and Isabella worked on a jigsaw puzzle they had started months earlier, a complex landscape that had challenged them both. But it was the quiet conversations that Eleanor knew she would treasure most. While the children were briefly occupied with their activities, she and James sat together on the window seat overlooking the garden, speaking in low voices about practical matters and emotional truths. "I've left detailed instructions with Margaret about the children's schedules," James said, ever the planner even in personal matters. "And I've spoken with their headmaster about my absence. Isabella's school play is in 6 weeks. Promise me you'll record it so I can watch when I return." "Of course," Eleanor replied, though the thought of attending their daughter's performance alone brought a fresh wave of sadness. James had never missed a school event, never been absent for the milestones that marked their children's growth. "There's something else," James continued, reaching into his jacket pocket. He withdrew a small wrapped package no bigger than his palm. "I wanted to give you this before I left. Something for you to open when you're missing me most." Eleanor accepted the gift with trembling fingers, feeling the weight of it, trying to guess its contents. "Should I open it now?" "No," James said gently. "Save it for when you need it most. You'll know when that is." The mystery of the unopened gift gave Eleanor something to focus on besides the approaching goodbye. She tucked it carefully into her jewelry box, alongside other treasures from their years together. As evening approached, the family gathered for dinner in the smaller, more intimate dining room they used for private meals. Cook had prepared all of James's favorite dishes, and even though none of them had much appetite, they made an effort to appreciate the gesture. The conversation was lighter than it had been in days, filled with shared jokes and gentle teasing that felt almost normal. After dinner, they walked together through the portrait gallery, a long corridor lined with paintings of James's ancestors stretching back centuries. These men and women had faced their own challenges, their own separations and sacrifices in service to crown and country. There was Sir William Ashford, who had served as an ambassador to France during the Napoleonic Wars. Lady Catherine Ashford, who had run the estate alone for 3 years while her husband served in India. "You come from a long line of people who understood duty," Eleanor observed, pausing before a portrait of James's great-great-grandfather in military dress. "And you're continuing that tradition," James replied, surprising her. "What you're doing? Supporting this mission, raising our children alone, maintaining everything while I'm gone. That's just as much service as what I'll be doing abroad." The observation touched Eleanor deeply. So often, the focus was on those who left, on those who traveled to dangerous places or took on visible roles. The ones who stayed behind, who maintained homes and families and stability, received less recognition for their equally important contribution. As the evening drew to a close, they tucked the children into bed together one last time. Both Isabella and Alexander clung to their father a little longer than usual, and Eleanor saw James memorizing the feel of their small arms around his neck, the sound of their voices whispering, "I love you." Papa into the gathering darkness later. In the privacy of their own bedroom, Eleanor and James held each other close, not speaking much but communicating everything through touch and presence. They had loved each other for nearly 2 decades, through the challenges of public life, the joys of parenthood, and the complex dance of 2 strong individuals building a life together. "I'm proud of you," Eleanor whispered into the darkness. "I'm proud of the man you are, the father you've become, the difference you're going to make." "I couldn't do any of it without you," James replied, his arms tightening around her. "You're my anchor, my home, my reason for everything." Tomorrow would bring the final goodbye, the actual moment of departure that both of them dreaded. But tonight they were still together, still able to give each other comfort and strength for the challenges ahead. In a few hours, Eleanor would have to learn to be strong without him, and James would have to find courage in a foreign land without her steady presence beside him. For now, though they had this moment, this last night of wholeness before distance and duty pulled them apart. The morning of departure arrived with cruel swiftness, bright and clear as if mocking the darkness that had settled over the Ashford family. Eleanor woke before dawn, her internal clock seemingly attuned to the significance of the day. Beside her, James slept fitfully, his brow furrowed even in rest, his hand unconsciously reaching for her across the space between them. She studied his face in the pale morning light filtering through the curtains, memorizing details she had looked at thousands of times but somehow felt she was seeing for the first time. The small scar on his chin from a childhood accident, the way his hair fell across his forehead when he wasn't carefully groomed, the laugh lines around his eyes that had deepened over their years together. In just a few hours, this face would be nothing more than a memory until his return. James stirred and opened his eyes, immediately finding hers. "Good morning, my love," he said softly, his voice rough with sleep and emotion. "Good morning," she replied, though there was nothing good about this particular morning. "Did you sleep at all?" "A little. I kept thinking about everything I wanted to say to you, everything I wanted to remember." He reached for her hand, interlacing their fingers in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing over their years together. They lay quietly for a few more minutes, postponing the inevitable beginning of departure day. Outside their window, the palace grounds were coming to life. Gardeners tended to the roses Eleanor loved so much, their blooms a riot of color in the morning sun. Staff members moved along the pathways with their usual efficiency, preparing for another day of service. Life continued its relentless forward march, indifferent to the personal drama unfolding in the ducal suite. Finally, they could delay no longer. James's flight was scheduled for 2 o'clock, and there were still final preparations to complete, last-minute briefings to attend, and the heartbreaking task of saying goodbye to their children. Isabella and Alexander joined them for breakfast in the family dining room, both children unusually quiet despite Eleanor's attempts to maintain normal conversation. Isabella picked at her toast while asking practical questions about how often James would be able to call, when he might be able to visit, whether the time difference would make communication difficult. Her questions were mature beyond her 12 years, but Eleanor could see the little girl underneath the composed exterior, the child who just wanted her father to stay home. Alexander was less articulate but more openly emotional, staying close to James throughout the meal and asking to sit on his lap, while the adults discussed logistics. He seemed to understand instinctively that this was different from previous business trips, that something fundamental was changing in their family dynamic. "I want to come to the airport," Isabella announced suddenly, her voice firm with decision. "I want to see Papa's plane take off." Eleanor and James exchanged glances. They had discussed this possibility but hadn't reached a firm decision. Public farewells at airports could be chaotic, with photographers and curious onlookers making private moments into public spectacles. But Isabella rarely asked for anything, and her request carried the weight of genuine need. The airport might be crowded, Eleanor said gently. "There will probably be reporters and photographers." "I don't care," Isabella replied with a maturity that was both admirable and heartbreaking. "I want to remember watching Papa leave, not just saying goodbye at home. It feels more real that way." James reached across the table to take his daughter's hand. "If that's what you want, sweetheart, then that's what we'll do. All of us together until the very last moment." The decision made, the morning took on a different rhythm. Instead of a private goodbye at the palace, they would face the cameras and crowds as a family, showing the world what love and sacrifice looked like in real time. It was a brave choice, one that would expose their raw emotions to public scrutiny. But Eleanor realized it was also an honest one. Margaret Thornfield arrived mid-morning to coordinate the airport logistics and provide a final briefing on security arrangements. The media interest had grown significantly since the press conference, with international outlets picking up the story of the Duke's humanitarian mission. There would be cameras at the airport, but Margaret had worked with security to establish clear boundaries, ensuring the family would have space for their private goodbye. As James's departure time approached, the palace took on an atmosphere of subdued activity. Staff members who had worked with the family for years offered quiet words of support and promises to take good care of Eleanor and the children during his absence. The head gardener brought Eleanor a small bouquet of roses from her favorite bush, a gesture that brought tears to her eyes with its simple kindness. James spent the final hour before leaving, double-checking his luggage and reviewing important documents. But Eleanor could see that his mind was only partially focused on practical matters. He was doing what she had been doing all morning, trying to memorize moments, storing up images and sensations to sustain him during the lonely months ahead. The children helped carry his bags to the waiting car, a task that under normal circumstances would have been handled by staff. But today wasn't about efficiency. It was about feeling useful, about participating in this significant moment rather than simply watching it happen. As they prepared to leave for the airport, Eleanor took one last look around their private quarters. Everything was exactly as they had left it, yet somehow the rooms already felt different, as if James's approaching absence had changed the very atmosphere of their home. Tonight she would return to these rooms alone, would sleep in their bed without him beside her, would wake tomorrow to begin learning how to live a temporarily different life. The drive to the airport was quiet, each family member lost in their own thoughts. James held Eleanor's hand tightly, while the children sat close together, Isabella protectively putting her arm around Alexander's shoulders. Through the car windows they could see ordinary people going about their daily lives, unaware that inside the official vehicle, a family was approaching one of the most difficult moments they had ever faced together. At the airport, they could see the media presence Margaret had warned them about. Photographers with long lenses waited behind barriers, and several television crews had set up equipment to capture the departure. But there were also ordinary people, families and individuals who had somehow learned of James's mission and had come to show their support. Some held signs thanking him for his service, others simply stood quietly, their presence a reminder that personal sacrifice and service to others resonated deeply with people from all walks of life. The final goodbye was approaching, and Eleanor felt as if she were walking toward the edge of a cliff, each step taking her closer to a leap she had to make but desperately wanted to avoid. The VIP lounge at the airport felt simultaneously too public and too intimate for what was about to unfold. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Eleanor could see James's plane waiting on the tarmac, its presence both magnificent and ominous. Soon that aircraft would carry away the most important person in her world, leaving behind only memories and the promise of eventual return. Security had created a small private area within the lounge where the family could have their final moments together without the intrusion of cameras, though Eleanor was acutely aware that dozens of lenses were trained on them from a respectful distance. The world was watching, but somehow that knowledge felt less intrusive than she had expected. Perhaps it was because their emotions were so raw, so genuine, that pretense was impossible. James knelt down to be at eye level with Alexander, his youngest child clinging to him with the desperate intensity of a 9-year-old who didn't fully understand why his father had to leave, but knew with absolute certainty that he didn't want him to go. "Remember what we talked about, buddy," James said gently, his large hands cradling his son's small face. I'm going to help people who don't have homes like ours, children who don't have enough food or safe places to sleep. Can you be brave for me while I'm gone?" Alexander nodded solemnly, though tears were streaming down his cheeks. "Will you really write to me every week?" "Every single week," James promised. "And I want you to write to me too. Tell me about school, about your friends, about the books you're reading. I want to know everything that's happening in your life. And you'll come back for my birthday?" Alexander asked, his voice small and hopeful. "I'm going to do everything in my power to be here for your 10th birthday," James replied, though Eleanor could hear the careful qualification in his words. He couldn't make promises about things beyond his control, but he could promise to try with everything he had. Turning to Isabella, James found his composure tested even more severely. His daughter stood straight and tall, clearly determined to be brave for her father's sake, but Eleanor could see the effort it was costing her. At 12, Isabella understood more about the dangers James might face, more about the complexities of international relations and humanitarian crises. Her fear was informed by knowledge, which somehow made it more heartbreaking. "I'm proud of how mature you're being about this," James told her, pulling her into a fierce hug. "But I need you to know that it's okay to be sad, okay to miss me, okay to cry when you need to. Being strong doesn't mean pretending you don't have feelings." "I know, Papa," Isabella replied, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "I'm going to take care of Mama and Alexander while you're gone. I'm going to be the best big sister and help with everything. I know you will, sweetheart. But remember, you're still a child too. Let Mama take care of you as well." James smoothed her hair, a gesture he had been making since she was a baby. "And keep writing in that journal of yours. I want to read all your thoughts and stories when I get back." The airport announcement system crackled to life, informing passengers that James's flight would begin boarding in 10 minutes. The sound was like a countdown timer, marking the final moments of their time together. Eleanor felt her chest tighten with panic. 10 minutes to say everything that mattered, to hold him close enough to last for months, to somehow pack a lifetime of love into a handful of remaining moments. James stood and turned to Eleanor, and she saw her own anguish reflected in his eyes. For 15 years they had faced every challenge together. They had weathered public scandals, family crises, the pressures of royal life, and the ordinary difficulties that tested every marriage. But they had never faced separation like this, with such uncertainty about duration and conditions. "I don't know how to do this," Eleanor whispered, her carefully maintained composure finally beginning to crack. "I don't know how to watch you walk away." "The same way you do everything else," James replied, his hands framing her face with infinite tenderness. "With grace, with strength, with the courage that first made me fall in love with you all those years ago. You're the strongest person I know, Eleanor. You can do this." "We can do this," she corrected, needing to maintain the sense of partnership that had sustained them through everything else. "We're going to do this together even when we're apart." James kissed her then, a kiss that was tender and desperate and filled with 15 years of shared love. It was a kiss that had to last for months, that had to convey everything words couldn't express. Around them, the noise of the airport faded away, leaving only this moment, this connection, this expression of a love that distance could not diminish. When they finally broke apart, both were crying openly, no longer caring about the cameras or the watching world. Some things were too important for pride, too profound for public composure. The final boarding call echoed through the terminal, impossible to ignore any longer. James gathered his children for one last group hug, holding all three of them as tightly as he could. Eleanor memorized the picture they made together, knowing it would have to sustain her through many lonely evenings ahead. Security personnel appeared discreetly nearby, a gentle reminder that the departure could not be delayed any longer. James kissed each of his children one more time, whispering private words of love and encouragement that only they could hear. Then he turned to Eleanor for their final goodbye, and she felt as if her heart might actually stop beating. This was the moment she had been dreading since receiving that first letter. The moment when loving someone meant letting them go. "I love you," James said simply, the three words carrying the weight of everything they meant to each other. "I love you too," Eleanor replied. "Come home safe to us." "I will," he promised. "Take care of our babies and take care of yourself. I'll be home before you know it." With that, James picked up his carry-on bag and walked toward the gate, turning back once to wave before disappearing down the jetway. Eleanor stood with her children, watching until he was completely out of sight. and then continued watching the empty space where he had been, as if she could will him back through sheer force of love. Outside on the tarmac, they could see passengers boarding the plane. Somewhere among those distant figures was James, finding his seat, storing his luggage, preparing for a journey that would take him thousands of miles away from everything he held dear. Eleanor pressed her hand against the window glass, wanting to be as close as possible to him for as long as possible. The plane pushed back from the gate with mechanical precision, beginning its taxi toward the runway. Eleanor felt Isabella slip her hand into hers on one side, Alexander take her other hand, and together the three of them watched as the aircraft carrying their husband and father lifted into the sky and disappeared into the clouds. The silence that followed was deafening. After months of preparation, days of anticipation, and hours of goodbye, James was gone. The first chapter of their separation had ended, and now Eleanor had to figure out how to write the chapters that would follow, how to keep their family strong and united, despite the fundamental absence at its center. As they prepared to leave the airport, Eleanor realized that something had changed in those final moments of goodbye. The anticipation of loss had been replaced by the reality of it, and somehow the reality was both harder and easier than she had expected. Harder because the absence was immediate and complete. Easier because now they could stop dreading what was coming and start learning how to live with what was. The drive back to the palace was shrouded in a silence that felt completely different from the quiet anticipation of the morning. This was the silence of absence, of adjustment, of three people learning to exist as a unit when they had always been four. Eleanor sat between her children in the back seat, one arm around each of them, trying to provide comfort while desperately needing it herself. Alexander fell asleep against her shoulder, emotionally exhausted by the intensity of the goodbye. His small face was tear-stained but peaceful, and Eleanor found herself grateful that children possessed such a capacity for restorative rest. Isabella remained awake, staring out the window at the passing countryside, her young mind undoubtedly processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. "Mama," Isabella said quietly, her voice barely audible above the hum of the car's engine. "Do you think the people Papa is going to help know how much he gave up to come to them?" The question revealed the depth of her daughter's understanding and the generosity of her heart. Even in her own pain, Isabella was thinking about the recipients of her father's sacrifice, the families who would benefit from his expertise and dedication. "I think they will," Eleanor replied, choosing her words carefully. "And I think that when Papa sees the difference he's making in their lives, it will help him know that our sacrifice has meaning too." The palace grounds came into view, familiar and welcoming but somehow changed by James's absence. The gardens that Eleanor had walked with her husband just the night before now stretched empty in the afternoon sun. The windows of their private quarters reflected the light without revealing the warmth of his presence behind them. As they entered the palace, Eleanor noticed how the staff members' greetings were gentler than usual, their eyes filled with sympathy and understanding. These people had served the family for years, had witnessed their joys and supported them through difficulties. They too felt James's absence not just as employees but as people who cared about the family they served. That evening, Eleanor found herself facing the first of many challenges she would encounter in the coming months: dinner time without James. The family dining room felt cavernous with only 3 place settings, and conversation struggled to fill the space his voice usually occupied. They talked about school projects and weekend plans. But underneath the surface normalcy was an awareness of the empty chair at the head of the table. After tucking the children into bed, Eleanor retreated to her own room and felt the full weight of solitude settle around her. The bed seemed enormous without James's familiar presence, and the silence felt oppressive rather than peaceful. For the first time since receiving news of his assignment, she allowed herself to truly feel the depth of her loneliness. It was then that she remembered the small wrapped gift James had given her, the one he had told her to open when she needed it most. With trembling fingers, she retrieved it from her jewelry box and carefully unwrapped the paper. Inside was a delicate silver locket, engraved with their wedding date and the coordinates of the place where James had proposed. When she opened it, she found a tiny photograph of their family and a small piece of paper with James's handwriting. "Wherever I am in the world, my heart is always here with you." The gift was perfect in its simplicity and profound in its message. Eleanor fastened the locket around her neck, feeling its weight against her skin like a physical reminder of James's love. It wouldn't replace his presence, but it would serve as a tangible connection to him during the difficult days ahead. That night, Eleanor began the first of what would become hundreds of letters to her husband. She wrote about the children's bedtime routines, about the way Alexander had asked 3 times if Papa's plane had landed safely, about Isabella's determination to maintain perfect posture at dinner, as if good behavior could somehow protect her father from harm. She wrote about her own fears and hopes, about the strange sensation of missing someone so intensely that it felt like a physical ache. The letter was longer than she had intended, filled with details both mundane and meaningful. Writing to James felt like continuing a conversation, like maintaining the connection that had sustained them through 15 years of marriage. When she finished, she sealed the letter in an envelope addressed to his temporary headquarters, the first of many that would cross continents to reach him. Over the following days, a new routine began to emerge. Eleanor threw herself into her royal duties with renewed intensity, finding purpose in ribbon cuttings, charity galas, and hospital visits. The work that had sometimes felt burdensome now became a welcome distraction, a way to channel her energy into something productive, while James was doing the same halfway around the world. The children adapted with the resilience of youth, though both showed signs of missing their father. Alexander developed a habit of drawing pictures to send to James, elaborate scenes of their family reuniting or adventures they would have when Papa returned home. Isabella became more helpful around the house, taking on responsibilities that went beyond her years and clearly modeling herself after her mother's example of grace under pressure. Letters from James began arriving within a week of his departure, and they became the highlight of Eleanor's days. His handwriting on the envelope was like receiving a piece of him across the vast distance. He wrote about the refugee camps he visited, the families he met, the small victories and heartbreaking setbacks that marked his work. But he also wrote about missing their bedtime routine, about dreaming of Eleanor's garden, about counting the days until he could hold them all again. The public response to their farewell had been overwhelming. Letters of support poured in from around the world, from military families who understood the pain of separation, from ordinary people who were moved by their display of love and sacrifice. Eleanor realized that their private moment of goodbye had resonated far beyond their own experience, had somehow given voice to the feelings of countless others who faced similar challenges. One letter particularly touched her heart. It came from a young mother whose husband was deployed overseas. "Your grace in saying goodbye gave me strength for my own farewell. Seeing your tears made me feel less alone in mine. Thank you for showing us that love is strong enough to survive any distance." 3 weeks after James's departure, Eleanor stood in their garden at sunset, the roses blooming in spectacular abundance. The beauty of the evening was almost painful in its perfection, the kind of moment that demanded to be shared but had to be experienced alone. She touched the locket at her throat and whispered words of love into the evening air, trusting that somehow across continents and time zones, James would feel her thinking of him. Tomorrow would bring another day of learning to live with absence, another day of supporting their children, another day of serving their country while their heart remained divided between duty and longing. But tonight, standing in the garden they had planned together, Eleanor felt a quiet strength settling into her bones. She could do this. They could do this. Love was proving itself stronger than distance, more enduring than separation, more powerful than the fear that had threatened to overwhelm them. The hardest goodbye was behind them. Now came the work of proving that some bonds cannot be broken, no matter how far apart they stretch.